This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. On this episode, I'm joined by Ryan Dickerson, an executive career coach and the founder of Good Fit Careers. With over a decade of experience in executive recruiting, Ryan has worked with top firms like Korn Ferry and Cardlytics, helping professionals navigate complex hiring processes, career transitions, and job searches. He's also the host of the podcast, Good Fit Careers, where he shares insights on finding fulfilling roles and building successful careers. Ryan and I met through another guest on my podcast, Varun Puri. He's the co-founder of Udly. You can check out that episode from October 2023 in the podcast feed. In addition to his work in coaching, Ryan and I share an interest in generative AI and how it can be applied to career coaching and the career search. And we start this conversation there talking about generative AI before we go into some more general advice from Ryan's experience for career switchers, as well as others who are preparing for a job search or interviews. I hope you enjoy this conversation on careers and professional life with Ryan Dickerson. Ryan, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thank you for having me, Gregory. It's an honor to be here.
So as I mentioned in that intro, Varun first introduced us because we were early coach users of Udly, which is an AI-powered platform for speech coaching. We're both early adopters of generative AI tools. Why don't you start there and tell me a little bit how these tools have changed the way you're working?
It has been quite a fun journey, I would say. The first AI tools that I got my hands on were kind of using the API version of, I think, GPT-3 before ChatGPT became a thing. And at first, I used it essentially as a sounding board, as a way to kind of refine my thoughts, whether I was helping to put someone's positioning together, so their resume, the content that would go in their LinkedIn profile, the way that they're describing their story, to today, where when I'm working with my clients who are typically executives who've been working for roughly 20 years, they have been with the same company for a while, perhaps they haven't updated their resume in 5 years or so, and we're going through building their whole story from the ground up. The way that I use AI now is that I'll have Varun's tool, you join us on the conversation. It'll record and transcribe everything. I'll also, just from a backup standpoint, have Google Meet record the meeting and transcribe it. And then I'll take those transcripts and I will run them through essentially what I would consider a chain of thought prompting process, where we start out with distilling the key components of the story. And through kind of this distillation, I'll then take that finished product, the notes essentially from our conversation and the key takeaways, and then run them through Gemini and run them through Claude and run them through ChatGPT, all with the same prompt, to see what comes out. And oddly enough, using that kind of mixture of models, or that mixture of experts kind of approach, one of the models will end up kind of picking up on it and producing information that I find is really useful, and that I'll just kind of follow that thread with that AI tool. And so now it is involved in pretty much everything that I do. And I think it's become indispensable. It's become like a great colleague.
Have you found that one of the models more than the other is right more often, or is there one that you enjoy working with more than the others, like the colleague who you really like to partner with versus the one who grudgingly you work with?
It is a horse race. It feels like every couple of weeks, there's a new version of a new model that comes out that is crisper or slightly more sharp. I think in my world, there really isn't a whole lot of right and wrong. I think one of the things that's so challenging about being a kind of a career coach or being involved in helping people find their way today is it's so fluid. And the work that I do, the work that people are doing now, is changing very quickly. And so it would be nice, but it isn't the case where I have a 2 + 2 = 4 sort of scenario. It's always does this feel true to that person? Does it read in a way that is consistent with the way that they would describe it or that I would describe it? I think today, I think the GPT-4o and then the o1 preview have been the sharpest. They've been the closest to my intention. But I've found that to get the most out of that specific set of models, it requires a really substantial amount of context. And so what I've come to find a big part of my work is today is helping my clients kind of build out a database essentially of every role they've had, every function they've held within that role, their key projects. And I find that with the Omni model and the O1 preview, if you do a good job of giving it a good bit of context to work from, it'll give you really robust answers. I think where I find all of the models to be lacking is they're not omnipotent. They don't know everything about me. They don't know everything about everyone. And so I think it's kind of, the old data science adage of garbage in, garbage out. And so I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the context or the artifacts that I'm providing from a foundational standpoint are robust. I think in a short answer today, it's been ChatGPT and the latest model there. 3 months ago, Claude 3.5 Sonnet was absolutely head and shoulders above the competition. And I'm really excited to see what their Opus model or their fourth generation model is going to look like.
And I should say for listeners, today is early October 2024. So by the time you listen to this, these details may have changed with regard to specific models. So it sounds like mostly you're operating the AI. And so you're a bit of like an interface operator between your clients and the AI. You're not pushing them to say, oh, hey, you should go use ChatGPT to do X, Y, and Z. You're having a conversation with them, taking the artifacts of that conversation, which are the transcripts, and then using whatever tool you choose or multiple tools to get to the next step in the process.
Yeah, let me clarify in a couple of ways. And this has been a moving target for me also. So when I think about the work that I'm doing with my clientele, the process that I follow is they're in a position where they're beginning to explore something new. They've been at the same company for a while and they're saying, okay, I'm feeling ready for a change. And we'll go through the process of building out their resume, building out their LinkedIn profile, and more of those are the same contextual information. Then we think through a go-to-market strategy. We think through how to prepare for interviews and do mock interviews. And then we talk through how to negotiate and establish a priority of values. And in that context, I'm helping get the information out of the client. I'm helping that executive figure out what information is going to be relevant to each individual role they've had. And I use Notion as the core workspace for this, but we're essentially building out a database of each role that they've had with every company. And that extraction process, that intake process is, I think, really the big lift that I do with these folks. I hope, and my intention is to set it up so that they can use AI on demand in the moment they need it with really good context behind it. So some of my clients do this, some of them don't. It all depends on kind of where they are in the adoption kind of phase. But I think in the most general of senses where I see it going is that we, the people, are going to be probably facilitating, right, and trying to figure out a graceful way to get enough information to be useful for the AI and then use the AI to just extend our reach. So yeah, I haven't really come up with a graceful way to describe it in general, but I use a kind of a symphony of different AI tools to get the deliverables that I'm working through. But I think more broadly, I'm hoping to be able to help build enough context for my clients to use AI however they see fit.
Are there tools like a Udly, for example, that are purpose built for one thing, like resumes or cover letters or interview prep, that you're using with any of your clients, or that you would recommend to someone because of your experience, maybe not a client, but someone who comes to you and isn't a great fit client for you? And you say, here are some things you might want to look at.
There isn't actually a specific product that comes to mind. The way that I would approach it is I would want to teach them how to fish. And the way that I've been using these tools is whatever the frontier model is. Typically these are closed source, right, proprietary models that you have to pay for. But building out a very clear set of instructions, whatever you want to describe it as, prompt engineering, I think that is the essence of what I hope to guide people towards. And the way that I see this, especially I think with the Claude environment, the way that they're doing projects and they're essentially letting you put in specific like components of the knowledge base into that environment and to essentially say, okay, here are 10 examples of what a well-written description should look like for your most recent role, giving it that background and saying, here's the model that we're following. Here are the ingredients, right? Here's all the context that I can provide to you. Here's my title, the title of my manager, my role, my function. And so my advice to people who would be looking for help like this and maybe looking for that ideal product is to try to write it themselves to a certain degree and say, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Here's what good looks like. Here are the ingredients that I'm working with to try to, get to that finished product. And I think as the models get better and better, I think we'll be able to essentially write our own little programs for that more effectively. I'm sure there are 1,001 different programs out there that people have made, but there isn't a specific one that I would endorse.
I had Jeremy Schiefling on the podcast recently, and he's been at the forefront here of using generative AI for things like LinkedIn and career exploration. And the analogy or the metaphor that I used with him is it's kind of like meal prep. You can get ready to pop in the oven meals, you can get meal kits, or you can learn to cook from scratch. And it sounds like what you're doing is cooking from scratch, developing your go-to recipes, and then teaching those recipes to some of your clients. And at the other end of the spectrum is the people who go out and they purchase a service that will do their resume for them and will help them with cover letters, but it's not going to be as bespoke. It's not going to be the flavor profile that really matches their palate. And they're not going to know what went into it because everything's happening behind the curtain.
I think that's a very fair and apt example. When I think about the way that I approach cooking, I very seldom go from a standard recipe, right? And I love to cook. It's probably one of my favorite things to do in general. My pandemic passion of learning how to make sourdough bread persists today. And every loaf is different. Every approach to that is different. I think perhaps what we're maybe observing here is that AI is enabling us to be more of whatever we are already. And I like to do things in an iterative kind of refinement style approach where, I do this one time with this version. 6 months later, there's a better model out there that does the same thing differently, but needs a different prompt. And I find that I really enjoy that process. So yeah, I imagine there's going to be a kind of a custom way or a bespoke way for everyone to do this in their own style, as we get further down this road.
Now, I think we'll probably come back to some of these AI-powered tools or AI-enhanced coaching later in the conversation, but I want to take a bit of a pivot here and talk about the actual coaching that you do. You have written about the importance of patience when career switching. And I know that your clients are a bit further along in their careers than many of the students that I work with and those who might be listening to the podcast. But I think patience is equally as important. I'd love to hear what that means for you and for your clients when you say it's important to be patient in the process of executing a career change or pivot.
I think patience is such an important component of any one of these changes, whether you're currently an employee and you're at any level within the business. Often the feedback cycle or that time it would take for you to have done a great job on something to then see the rewards. In almost every corporate role I've had and with almost every client that I work with, there's typically this discrepancy or this gap between their coup de grace moment, they've delivered something truly exceptional to the promotion, right? Or to the raise or to the bonus. And it takes a long time typically for businesses to do a good job of rewarding you or recognizing you in a way that feels authentic. So the first concept around patience is to give yourself a minute to say, okay, I may have just delivered this and it may have been my core focus. I put everything into delivering this project and I haven't seen, I didn't see a big bonus or I didn't see a promotion until 6 months or a year later. And so I think setting those reasonable expectations that the company is probably going to be slower than we might want it to in the way it rewards us I think is the first one. The next one is, as you're thinking through, perhaps for the core audience of this podcast, as you're thinking through where you want to go and you're thinking through what the path forward might be for you. I think my advice from a patient standpoint there is to be slow and deliberate about what path you decide to go. The folks who have rushed down the path to say, okay, my parents were doctors, I'm going to be a doctor, sometimes don't end up being happy in that career path,
Yeah,
but
I
they were
see
very
a lot of
quick.
our students who obviously they went to school for something, they had a first career, and a lot of
Yeah,
them realized like that wasn't the right career for them. And I can say that for
yeah,
myself as well. I've had a couple I don't want to say dead ends, but I've kind of ended up in a cul-de-sac and realized,
yeah,
you know what, I want to go back out and get back out onto the main road and see what else is down there.
yeah,
I hear that there is that sense, you're 18 years old, 19 years old, you're being asked to pick a major to think about what you're going to do, quote, for the rest of your life. And you come out of your undergraduate, you get a job, you work for a little while, and then you realize this isn't what I expected it to be. This isn't what fulfills me. And then you're trying to think, okay, well, what's the thing I do next?
hmm The tricky part, I think, now is that we might, instead of thinking about what we're going to do for the rest of our life, we might be thinking about what we're going to do for the next 4 or 5 years.
Hmm.
And that'll be its own clean, clear chapter, of one's professional journey. So I think we have to find that balance of being patient and thoughtful and deliberate, but also experimenting and trying very broadly all the different things that you might be interested in. I think the last piece of patience that I would share is within the job search itself. One of the things that's so tough about going into a job search is having clear and reasonable expectations about how long it's actually going to take. Most of the time, when you're at a pretty senior level, right, you're being paid, you're compensated very well. You're in a kind of rare air in the sense that there aren't all that many positions open. It takes a while to land that job. And working your way through the grind of networking your way into these and consistently being on the ball of interviewing and applying, it takes a long time and it's not an easy process. So I think having patience as you begin to go into your search, once you have your path, can also make for, I think, just a better experience as you go through it.
I want to come back to something you said about sort of the promotion or the raise. A lot of
Yeah.
companies, there's a cycle. And you may have had that
hmm
great accomplishment, and it might be right at the beginning of that cycle. And there
Yeah.
is no mechanism by which to give that promotion, to level up, or to give that raise until the cycle comes back around, 11 months later.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue that there certainly is a way to pay that bonus or make that promotion. I think I think where we're going to see companies having to adapt to a certain degree. In a traditional sense, if you're at a big consulting firm or you're at a large Fortune 500 company, given just the scale and magnitude, of course, that cycle will make sense, right? And it'll be a 6 month thing or a quarterly thing or an annual thing. But when I really think about how business is changing today, I also imagine that there are going to be companies who can find a way to work past that structure. So yes, if you're in a traditional, knowledge work career path and you're going to go down that road, understanding that that's the cycle, and then being, I think having reasonable expectations about what that reward's going to be, how substantial it is, how quickly it's all going to happen, I think is extremely important. But I also think that we're in this kind of interesting moment in history where those sorts of changes, I think, might start to become more important. Because imagine you're in an era where we're going, each model that we're seeing coming out is better and better and better. And our ability to be creative with those becomes more and more important. If I or you or anyone out there comes up with a $1 billion idea and capitalizes on that within 6 months, and they still have 6 more months to wait before they see a raise or a promotion, they're probably not going to stick around, right? And so I think as the pace of business changes, I imagine we're going to see some sort of adaptation there, for the individuals and for those cycles that we mentioned.
Working with more senior level people, but I think this applies almost at all levels. Do you think that there's a value to having patience to the patience to develop that sort of tenure of experience and maybe political capital and understanding of a company? So where some people maybe in this culture, in this time, just like you said, are like, well, they don't respect what I do, or they're not recognizing me. I'm going to go find someplace else to go. The flip side of that,
Mhm.
do you ever counsel your clients to like, I think it's time to stay put and
Mhm.
set your target within this organization for how you're going
Yeah.
to get to that next level?
I see a balance of the two. I think the two categories that I would see in this are people who've made that substantial investment, right? They've been there for, call it, 3 or 4 years now, and they're in a pretty good group, but they haven't really advanced as far as they want to go. And they're saying, like the patience components may be coming into play here, where it's like, I haven't really seen that path. I haven't seen the growth that I'm hoping for, but they're several years in, things are going relatively well. And so I think in those circumstances, I certainly encourage people to stick it out, right? And to find the things that they enjoy in their work, find the things they enjoy outside of their work, and lean into those. I think in other circumstances, when let's say you've been there for 10 years or 15 years and you've advanced some, but you're starting to kind of feel that more broad, I'm ready for a change. I'm curious about other things. What I encourage them to do is to maintain their day job, right? Don't blow things up. Don't burn any bridges. Don't ruin your references, but to start to more proactively look outside. And so I think that one of the hardest things about coaching, at least in my experience today, is that for every individual, it's subjective. And for every person, what sticking it out versus exploring something new, the implications are going to be different for a whole bunch of different folks. So the way that I would encourage your audience to think about this, and if you're, let's just say that you're an MBA student and you're beginning to think about, okay, I did my first 4 years of my working life in this arena. I'm coming back and getting more education. I'm learning, I'm growing. Where do I see this through? Do I go back and get my MBA paid for, right? Or do I go and I venture into something new? The way that I would encourage you to think about it is, would going back into that environment, would that overall calculus lead you to a place where you're doing the work that you genuinely enjoy, that you actually love, that is going to be needed and valuable for the next several years? And there's a very clear path to you getting into that, whatever next level means, whether you're deeper as an individual contributor or you're growing in terms of your responsibilities or you're, managing a team. If you're in the position where you're saying, that sounds tired or boring, or I feel like I'm going to be kind of running that same path and I don't see a lot of change, and there's another real exciting opportunity in front of you, then perhaps consider, exploring the risky play. But it has to be one of those where you've at least got some sort of line of sight to whatever that new opportunity might be.
Do you have any advice for folks who are in a job right now who are starting to think like, okay, I want to see what else is out there. I want to test my value on the market. How to balance that with continuing to show up and do good work every day at their current position?
That's such a tough position to be in, but I imagine one where there are thousands, if not millions, of people who feel that way right now. If you're in one of those positions where you're stably employed and things are either, going just fine or not quite as well as you'd like, and you're beginning to explore more broadly, I would start thinking about what are those healthy boundaries that you need to establish within your working life and then with the exploration of that next chapter. And so the core advice that I would give is keep doing your job. Keep delivering for the people that are paying you to do that work, that make your life possible. But I think also start to think about, what are the things, if I know that I'm not going to stay, I, I feel like that quiet quitting concept of a few years ago didn't really feel true to how I would want to describe this. I think instead of I know that I'm like bailing on this company, I would encourage you to think about, okay, I know I'm doing the job as I see it now to a degree that I would be proud of and that would be referenceable, but perhaps I'm not doing that 125% that I would need to get a phase shift or a substantial promotion. So finding those boundaries and saying, okay, I can do the core function of my work and still have enough gas left in the tank to start looking outside. I think that would generally be the advice. But to defend some of the employers out there, they hired you for a reason. They're paying you for a reason, right? If they very clearly see that you're totally checked out, you're not doing a service for them. You're not doing a service for yourself. And when you think about, that network that we're building, that's so essential to getting jobs in the future, if your past manager was like, yeah, they were great for 6 months, and then the last 3 years, they've just been like phoning it in, that's not really the reference you want to create there. So the other piece of advice might be to try to build that relationship with your manager and begin to communicate to them the path that you're headed towards and where you're going. What I've come to find working with senior executives and really the ones that I admire the most, they hear their people out. They listen to them and they say, oh, I didn't know that you wanted to go from marketing into analytics, right? Or from data science into software engineering. But I know now, right? And how can I help you get there while you still help me do what I need to do? Sometimes just being open and communicating in a non-threatening, non-hostile, but more aspirational kind of way can open some of those doors and can also kind of give you the chance to keep doing your day job and then explore those other opportunities within the same company.
I think that's some good advice, right? Communication is key. And your boss, your manager, they can't help you if they don't know that you have some intention or that there's some kind of problem. So
Yeah.
articulating what your goals are, making it clear, and regularly checking in about whether you can move in that direction. A lot of companies, they've made an
Hmm.
investment in you as an employee. They don't want to lose you. They obviously think that you're
Hmm.
a great fit for the company. And if
Hmm.
there's a different team or a different function that you want to move into, articulating that, setting a plan, maybe doing some projects that allow you to get experience is a great way
Yeah.
to go. And I certainly have examples of former students of mine, alums of the Foster School of Business, who have done just that, gotten into
Hmm.
a team at the beginning and said, what I really want to do is X. And they tell everyone that they encounter that, they want to work in sustainability. And within 9 to 18 or 24 months, they're on the sustainability team, for example,
Hmm.
because they let everyone
Yeah.
know and they chartered that course. Um,
And I think the only thing that if I may add to it is that finding a graceful way to do this that isn't humiliating for your manager or embarrassing for the company or isn't, you're not becoming the sour grape or that squeaky wheel in a way that's more like acting out than proactively trying to communicate. And I think that that's a really hard balance to strike. If I were in the audience and I was, an early career professional, one of the things I'd look out for is if I find a graceful and appropriate way to bring up my desire to explore this new path to my manager and they're not receptive to it. I think that's also a really good moment to think about, okay, do I continue to be open and clear and say, this is where I'd like to go? Or am I really getting shut down here? And do I need to shift that effort into exploring externally? I think how that is responded to can also be very telling.
and this is also where coaches and mentors can be a fantastic resource, even just to, have the sort of simulate the conversation or to game out what that conversation might look like. And I
Yeah.
suspect that, people could probably use ChatGPT or one of these other tools, or in Udly, you can create a simulation of a conversation, give it the persona and the scenario and see how it goes to just sort of break
Yeah.
that ice and feel what it might
Oh,
feel like
yeah.
to be in that conversation.
Even just watching your own response, just watching the tape. And if you set up a scenario where it's like, Gregory, how are you feeling about your current career path? How do you feel about your current role? And you record 2 or 3 minutes of you riffing on that, just watching yourself go through that can be like, wow, dude, I look like I am miserable. Or, I'm like, there's a real drag here. Or, it really doesn't sound that bad, man. You should just, stick it out. Right?
Yeah.
Like you can see it in yourself as much as perhaps these can reflect it to you.
So sometimes a candidate is a little bit risky choice for a company. How do you work with clients, or what advice might you have to a candidate who might be considered risky either because of the level of experience they have, or they're shifting industry, or they're shifting function, to
Hmm.
de-risk the choice for the hiring manager or even the recruiter so that they can get
Hmm.
that interview with the hiring manager?
The first thing that I tend to teach people, and this is all just my opinion based on my experience, is that you cannot force a good fit. And I think at the end of the day, every company will have a risk tolerance. Every person will have a risk tolerance. And when I think about a person who's been a dentist for 15 years who all of a sudden wants to become a test pilot or an astronaut, right? Like, that's pretty risky and that's
Yeah.
probably not going to happen, right? But go get your pilot's license. Go have fun in whatever way is going to, like fill your cup. I think the way that I would encourage people to think about their risk profile is to think about what real problems can I solve for the business, and do the things that can be seen as risky in my background contribute, perhaps if we reframe them, to what will make me more valuable. I think about one of the people that I've worked with who was a chief executive officer for a large advertising company. And he had grown from essentially a mid-level professional all the way to the head of the company. He got to the point where he was ready to make a change. And as you're considering making a change like that to go to either be another CEO or to be in your own private practice or whatever structure you want to look at, the way that we helped him move into a chief marketing officer position was by framing how important it was to understand how the advertising world, how leadership works at that level. And he was able to take his experience from being, a manager of a several hundred person company to being a CMO of a several thousand person company. And what might have been seen as risky, right, from the hiring party standpoint is that, oh, you haven't been a chief marketing officer, or you were not most recently a chief marketing officer. He said, well, sure, yes, but, right, they have been my clients, right? And they have been my direct reports clients. And I have served them very well across far more industries and far more campaigns and functions than I ever would have had exposure to if I had just been on the CMO track. So I think the core piece of advice here is start thinking about what is the real problem that is being hired to solve, right? So why are we investing in this? If you can clearly understand the problem, and then you can present another perspective on how your experiences, the combination of who you are and where you come from and what you can do, are improved, right, by those constituent experiences, then I think you'll be able to bridge the gap. If you're at a position where it's like, man, I wouldn't hire me to do that job. If you wouldn't hire yourself, if you wouldn't spend your own, hard-earned money on paying yourself to do this job, why would anyone else? So I think there's a component of calibration and reality, and then seeing if you can really solve the problem.
I think I hear two things in that. One is empathy for your customer, in this case, the person who's going to hire you. And the other is confidence and belief in your own abilities to do the job. And these both seem really important. So
Yeah.
there are a lot of ways to develop confidence. We're not going to get into those today, I don't think. But I want to talk about this empathy piece, because I know when I work with students early in their MBA career, as they're looking for internships, oftentimes they're very focused on their own experience and telling their own story, but not focused so much on the person that they're speaking to. So we work a lot with them on thinking about your audience, thinking about the hiring manager, thinking about the recruiter, thinking about who you're talking to in that moment, whether it's in a networking context or an interview context, so that you can have that empathy for them. I know you've written a little bit about this idea of having empathy for the hiring manager. What does that look like today in late 2024, as opposed to maybe 2 or 3 years ago? And what advice do you have for candidates related to putting themselves in the shoes of the person that might be interviewing them or making the decision as to whether to hire them or not?
There's so many different roads that I could go down here. I think to give the high level in a few different directions and then maybe drill down on one. The first thing that I would think about in terms of developing your own empathy as a candidate going into a hiring process is, first and foremost, the market forces change frequently. It's very fluid and dynamic. I think when, a few years ago, I would consider it more of a seller's market in the sense of I have my experience to bring to the table, and there are just not enough people to fill those roles. And so people were, getting into bidding wars over candidates. Offers were flowing quickly and easily. And I think in, later phases, I think we're seeing this now, is that, those offers are a little bit more hard to come by. A little bit, there's a little bit of a less of a risk tolerance like we talked through before. The other thing that I would think through on developing the empathy beyond just being able to kind of read the cycle of where we are is to start thinking about, I don't know, I think in the most simple of senses, just reversing your roles. And I would imagine for somebody who's an MBA candidate, who's just about to finish their program, who's beginning to interview for roles out there, and perhaps they're spending a lot of time in the interview talking about, I really want the opportunity to lead, and I want P&L opportunities, and I want to be able to grow into a bigger position to both earn more money and have more responsibility and have greater accomplishments. I think in a lot of senses, if you were to hear that and you were to, be on the other side of the table, you're like, oh, well, great. That sounds wonderful, but what are you going to do for me? And why should I pay your salary? And why should I, essentially learn, like allow you to learn and fail with me, right? To grow, right? And what am I going to get out of it? And so what I would encourage the MBA crowd or anybody who's beginning to look for a role and beginning to interview for it, to spend a moment looking at the people that you're going to be helping, looking at the people that need your help, and think about where are they coming from and why are they making this investment. If you're going into these, positions where you really do want to grow, I would think through, what are the things that are going to help my manager get promoted? What are the things that are going to help the business succeed and grow to the point where we must hire more people? What are the real net impacts on the business that will pave the road for me to continue to have these opportunities? And while, of course, I think we all should want to grow and learn and have those opportunities, I think if we can look at it from the other side of the table and say, how do we make whatever we're doing so very successful that we have to grow, right? And that we have to adapt to change to the increase in demand for what we're doing. That might be a graceful way to, phrase the conversation and say, boss, how do we get this to the point where we are so successful that I get to hire a team because we're doing so much business, right? That I and you and together we can't handle it all, right? As opposed to, how do I get to the point of becoming a manager and a P&L owner?
Right. So thinking a little bit more about the value that you bring, the outcomes that you can create, rather than the destination for your own career of where you want to be.
And the destination may be the same, right? And it may just be a reframing of this. But I think in general, the other piece that I think tends to be really helpful today is with more and more people being entrepreneurs and starting their own businesses and thinking about, hey, I'm only going to hire, right? Or I'm only going to pay contractors to do the little things that I don't have expertise in. If you can think about like, wow, I was able to make their business actually grow with my few hours of input, thinking through it in that way where it's like, what's the problem? What do they really need? How do I solve that? How do I over deliver on that? And thinking about the outcomes for your client, be that your employer or yourself or whomever. I think that thinking about the impact and the outcome tends to really make the biggest difference.
So I think the conversation has taken us exactly where I wanted to go, which is ending with some real tactical advice for candidates on how they can tailor resumes, cover letters, conduct interview prep. Once you've helped your clients narrow in on their direction, figure out whether they're trying to move up in the current organization or move out to something else, what are those next steps and what advice do you have related to these still very important artifacts, as well as activities like networking, which you mentioned earlier, that people can put into practice, as soon as they finish with this episode?
The first thing that I would encourage people to do is think about the players on the field and what is going to matter to each of them. So if you're going to go out and seek a new role, you're going to be the candidate. There are going to be other people who are assessing you and trying to figure out, are you the right fit for us? Can you solve the expensive problem that we're solving for? The tactical advice that I would provide here is when you're describing your previous work and your previous accomplishments, our role as the candidate is just like we would be an attorney in the court of law. And the jury would be the hiring party. Their job is to assess and draw conclusions. And we don't want to characterize, right, as the attorney. We want to essentially present the evidence in a way that our audience, the jury, can derive their own conclusions. So if you're trying to say, I had a great year last year, probably not the right bullet point to throw on the resume there, but to say that our target from a sales standpoint was $1 million. And we, over the course of 6 months, hit 1 million. And then by the end of the year, we hit 2.5. You're not saying that it was great. You're just saying, here was our target and here are the outcomes. If you can go a layer deeper and share not only here was the goal and here is what we accomplished, but say, here is how we did it, then your audience, the people who might be hiring you, whether you're on a contract or you're working on a full-time gig, they will be able to say, okay, I understand that through the process of building your sales funnel and connecting with individual people, having those conversations, working them through that buyer journey, right? And we used Salesforce to manage our CRM. And, we did these different techniques and we use these different tools to get to our end goal. That can allow the people who are making, drawing the conclusions, making the hiring decision, they can give them a sense of confidence. That's like, okay, I understand how you went about doing this. I understand what you did. I understand the goals and then the outcomes. And that then gives that person who's making the decision the confidence that, wow, okay, I understand. And you don't need to characterize, you don't need to tell me how great you are. I can see it plain as day. It's right there.
So it's
So I
build the
think
case,
making it very clear.
present the evidence, provide enough context, probably stay away from superlatives that can't be
Yeah,
backed up by numbers.
exactly. It's so tough in this subjective world where hiring is really hard, right? And being hired is really, really difficult. And I think when we're in those positions, bringing things down to the most simple and elemental components make it a lot easier, right? And when we think about how hiring tends to really work, right? Like the reason why referrals tend to go so much further is that we have a next level of trust. If you're new to them, presenting the information in a way that builds trust and builds confidence, in a non-superlative kind of way, I think really does make a big difference.
So you mentioned referrals, and referrals often grow out of networking or investing in and reactivating your network. Do you have any advice that you would offer job seekers about engaging with their network and making those investments that maybe yield off-market opportunities as well as more fruitful leads for jobs?
Make the investment, spend the time. The best thing that I can encourage you to do is start with the people that you know you're going to have a really good conversation with. I think that we can, as a job seeker, build things up and make it so that it's like, oh, I need to network with 500 people to get this job. And with that huge goal ahead of you, you end up networking with no one. So I think my first piece of advice is pick just a couple of folks that you really enjoyed either working with or you were great friends with. And you can set it up as something as simple as like, hey, I'm testing out my networking skills. We've been buddies forever. Can we just chat for 30 minutes and just talk and let me try this out with you? Right? Kind of like a mock interview with a good friend. I think from there, right, once you kind of get past the general nerves of getting out there, is try to set a very simple and direct goal. Say, okay, I'm going to try to get 2 or 3 real conversations on the calendar this week. And one of the pieces of advice that I heard from one of my past clients that really stuck with me was that networking without an agenda often yielded better outcomes than going in and saying that I want you to refer me to this role. And it took a good bit more activity. You had to have more conversations, but it seemed as though it yielded better outcomes in terms of that finished, actually got the job. So if you can go into these conversations and say, hey, I want to hear what's going on in your world. I would love to try to contribute any ideas that I can share to whatever problems that you're facing. And I really just want to get to know you
We often
and
talk
not
about
ending the
that.
call with,
We often talk about
I'm
that
sorry.
as being more relational than transactional. If
Yeah.
you go in and you say, "Hey, can you refer me for this job?" It kind of shuts down the conversation right away because A, they might not be able to refer you for that job, and B, they might just feel like you're using them or being really transactional. And instead,
Yeah.
if you go in thinking about how can you bring value to this relationship, and I just did a little podcast about this as well, just myself, talking about the idea of reframing the activity of networking. And instead of thinking, what can this person do for me? Thinking, what can I learn from this person? And what could I offer this person? What value could I offer
Yeah.
them? Can really shift that
Yeah.
experience of having the conversation and ultimately strengthening the relationship.
Very well said, Gregory. And I think to just complement your point there, if someone reached out to you and they connected with you on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm just meeting more professionals in the space. I'd love to spend a little bit of time getting to know you. And that person leaves the conversation having had their mind blown with all the brilliant things that you brought to that discussion, and you didn't ask them for anything. They're going to have a pretty positive opinion of you, and they're pretty likely to when something, comes, across their desk that might be a good fit, be like, oh yeah, they need to talk to this person. They showed me all these new things and taught me all this stuff. I think that can be a proactive way to do it. Doesn't make it all that much less of a grind, and it's still a lot of work. But I think if you can go into this in a giving sense and in a helpful sense, it can really pay off.
Yeah, and I had Steve Dalton, the author of the 2-Hour Job Search and the Job Closer, on my podcast during the pandemic, and we talked about networking meetings, the Tiara framework, and all of that. And folks can find it in the podcast feed or on the website at conversationsoncareers.com. And for people who really don't know what that conversation should go like, that is just a great recipe to follow. Going back to our cooking analogy, he likes to talk about that. It's baking. Follow the recipe exactly, and you will get the results. It's not like, oh, I'm going to add a little dash of this in. Once you master the recipe, then maybe you can modify it a little bit or figure out which parts work best for you. There's some other resources like the 20-minute networking meeting that, folks can also look up, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. I want to finish this segment with one last question, which is about the actual interview. So you, I presume, work with your clients to prepare them for the interview once they get the interview. You have any quick tips that you would share for candidates on thinking about interview prep?
Certainly. The first thing is know what kind of interview you're going into. I think the spectrum of interviews that I've seen are introductory calls, what I would consider a screening call. From there, you might have a hiring manager interview or a cultural fit assessment or a technical interview. Sometimes you're going into a panel interview. Sometimes if you're a senior executive, you're going to dinner with a board member, and they all have different connotations. They all have different objectives. And what I would first encourage you to think about is, what are they trying to accomplish? What am I supposed to do? What is my part in this process? I think the second thing to think through is, how do I begin to structure my responses to questions? This is a dynamic thing and something that I need to work on, and I think that everybody can improve their skills on. But being able to first and foremost have a very clear sense of what you're trying to say when you begin to answer a question, and give them essentially the conclusion up front. Say, here would be my clear answer to a direct question, and then opine if appropriate. But I think starting with a clear understanding of what am I supposed to be doing here? What is being asked of me? And how do I make it as easy as possible for the people on the other side to do their job well? I think that's the biggest thing that I'd focus on.
Comes back to the empathy, understanding what the person across the table is thinking, what they need to do, and making the job easy for them. So the answer first, basically, no long exposition that distracts them from the actual core nugget of information that they need. Don't make it hard to find.
Which is so hard to do. And I think as all the listeners who've made it this far on the show will have heard me wax on more than I probably should have on several of these questions. When it's a complicated topic and you know a good bit about it, it is so very difficult to get it down to that one clear, perfect response. So don't beat yourself up too much about it. We are all imperfect. But if we can try to say, here's really what you're looking for, and then I'm happy to go into further depth, I think that's typically very well received.
All right, last question. Are there any resources that you regularly share with clients, your audience, prospective clients? I'm thinking about books, podcasts, websites, or tools that you recommend people engage with if they're in an active job search or thinking about getting into one?
It's so interesting. I don't have anything that I always start with or that I always recommend. The ones that I've found that have been the most impactful recently are not necessarily go read this book, but the one that I think has been the best is Perplexity. Perplexity is essentially a wrapper, right, for any different model to essentially go and do research.
And when you're saying model, you're talking about these AI transformer models like ChatGPT and so forth.
You got it. Precisely. And what I think is so interesting about the way that Perplexity works is it is a tool that you can essentially, it's an answer engine. You can ask questions and it'll go through using whichever AI model. So you can use an open source Llama model, you can use GPT 4.0, you can use Claude 3.5 Sonnet, whatever you choose. And you ask it a question and it'll go through and it'll look up sources, provide an answer, and it'll provide you citations to every single thing it says. And then you can kind of go down that rabbit hole. I think that's been the number one thing that I've shared with people, because it lets you ask whatever you want and then find a whole bunch of good sources. I think more and more today, it's going to be harder and harder to say, oh, go read this book or this blog. I think that having multiple sources tends to be the most powerful today. So perplexity.ai.
Yeah. And our students at the Foster School and at the University of Washington, and I think at just about any other higher education institution, should know that at least right now in October, I just got an email forwarded to me. You can access Perplexity Pro with your .edu email address for free for 1 year, as I understand it.
Wow.
And many universities are also making arrangements with other tools like ChatGPT or Copilot from Microsoft. So again, at the University of Washington, across all of our campuses, I believe, students have access to Copilot for free. And then at some schools, ChatGPT and other tools are made available. So before you go subscribing and paying with maybe your limited resources, check to see what you can do for free. And know that even if you don't have access through a university program, a lot of these tools give you a lot before you have to start paying or before you feel like you push up against the limits that you need. And I'll put some links in the show notes to these things that we discussed. I really want to thank you, Ryan, for taking the time to have this conversation on careers and professional life with me today.
Thank you for having me, Gregory. It was great to be here.
Last thing, where can people find you if they want to follow you, learn more about your business, see your podcast, or things that you're writing?
You should follow me on LinkedIn. The podcast is called Good Fit Careers, and the second season is going to come out sometime mid next year. And goodfitcareers.com is the central hub for the blog and all the other content.
Of course, links to all of those will be in the show notes. Thanks again.
Thank you, Gregory.
I really enjoyed talking to Ryan about how he's using generative AI, and we probably could have done the whole podcast episode on that one topic alone. He had some great advice to share on a variety of topics, including the idea of having empathy for the people who are interviewing you, de-risking yourself as a choice for a hiring manager, the importance of networking and thinking about that in a more relational rather than transactional way, as we discussed, and thinking about how candidates can really articulate the value that they bring rather than what they're trying to get out of the job that they're interviewing for. As always, you can find links to some of the resources we discussed and other information in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com. Thank you for listening to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate. Help others find the show by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com.